So just going to briefly touch on what our mitigation plan process kind of looked like over the last year and a half, where we currently are in that planning process, and then some observations that I have that I would like to improve upon going into the future. Obviously, 5 years is our requirements, but there's nothing stopping us from making improvements in the immediate as well. So within the next 10 minutes, let me get rid of that. So where we currently are at, our plan is at the tail end of our update process. Right now, it is at the State Emergency Management Office in review. We had one sit-down meeting with the DEMA folks to go over any issues that they might have with our current draft. We are making the edits that are necessary and hope to have that plan back to DEMA here in the next 2 to 3 weeks, which will put us on a timeline to have an approved plan in June of this year. So going backwards, like I mentioned, the hazard mitigation plan has to be updated every 5 years. Our current plan lapsed in status in December of 2020, and I do want to touch on that here in the future. But so long and the short of it, when we update a county hazard mitigation plan, our county hazard mitigation plan, I should say, it's multi-jurisdictional. So for those that are in the region that have participated, I see a lot of familiar names in the chat. They just went through this with me as well at their jurisdictional level. But for those that are unfamiliar with hazard mitigation planning, here in Maricopa County, we include all jurisdictions, cities and towns that want to participate, as well as tribal entities, tribal nations in our submittal. The reason for this is we've been doing it for the last 15 years. It's a little cleaner and easier. And then for us to be able to provide assistance to our local emergency managers who are multi-hatted, sometimes aren't even emergency managers by trade. They just happen to be the one person that wasn't in the meeting when they decided to give out the job duties of emergency management. So for us, it's a little cleaner, a little simpler. And there are additional strengths, regional collaboration for us here in the Phoenix area. Most of our jurisdictions, you don't know where one border ends and another begins. So again, for the majority of the planning participants, participating as one submittal every 5 years helps them out, helps us out. And so we've been doing it that way for the last 3 iterations of our hazard mitigation update. For the planning process, each jurisdiction has their own planning teams, and I did want to mention this because a lot of people are either unaware or sometimes believe that the county, because it has our name right there on the front page, we can dictate everything that is included in it. And while we would like to believe that we have final authority over everything that's in the plan, it's just not true. Each jurisdiction is responsible for their own work. Each jurisdiction has their own planning teams. Each jurisdiction has to do all the steps that the county has to take in order for FEMA to approve their portion of the plan. So when it comes time to submitting it to the federal government for approval, we will submit the entire plan all at once with everybody's names and information up to date and information in it. And the federal government will look at it on a one jurisdictional basis. So for us, our portion for unincorporated county will not be denied if one of the local jurisdictions has errors in their components of their plan, and vice versa. So for Phoenix, if they submit and they're good to go and we are not, they will get an approved letter. We will have to then make changes, and there's timelines and there's a bunch of other details, but we're not all locked in together for the final approval process. The big components for the plan itself, the plan update, are the 4 bottom bullets. the hazard analysis, the community description, the development trends, as well as ensuring that we did not complete this plan in a silo. So it requires us to involve the public. For hazard analysis, again, each jurisdiction has to conduct their own hazard analysis. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of similarities with us being in the same geographic location here in the state, but there are some significant differences as well. You can look at a jurisdiction like Tempe or Guadalupe. Their wildfire risk obviously is not going to be anywhere near as severe as a Wickenburg or a Phoenix because of the WUI area up along I-17. So again, each jurisdiction has to complete their own hazard analysis. We can't just copy and paste from one jurisdiction to the next. It has to be unique, and all of our jurisdictions have completed that component as well. Community description and development trends. The reason that those are high level topics for any plan, hazard mitigation plan update, is it wants you to identify your community so that then when you complete your hazard analysis, you can obviously have a better idea of the risk that your community faces. Development trends, again, is just forward thinking, where you project growth, i.e. development in your jurisdiction. So if you identify an area that is known to be at risk of fissures and your development in your jurisdiction is going into that direction, obviously the plan should then focus on what mitigation strategies you have in place to protect that community as it grows into that known risk area. And like I mentioned at the start of this slide, we cannot complete this plan on our own. It would be a lot easier for me just to sit down and do it all with no participation from any jurisdictions or the public, but that's just not appropriate. And so one of the requirements is that we complete public outreach. In fact, we have to do two iterations of it. Once at the beginning where we afford the public an opportunity to provide input into the risk and hazards that they believe they face day to day, as well as what we currently are doing right now on our draft stage, is affording them an opportunity to review the entire plan front to back and to provide any type of input on what we have come up with as a draft plan before we submit to FEMA. So with that, like I said, I do want to talk about some challenges in some areas that I observed. The first one, obviously, we've all been experiencing it, is COVID and the impact that it has had on all of us. For us, our two big delays from our plan being lapsed in December of 2020 to where we currently are now with anticipating an unapproved plan in June of 2021 was there was federal delays at the beginning. We submitted for a grant to assist us financially with this project, and it took a little while longer than what traditionally has happened from federal review and approval to actually receiving the approval letter so we could start doing outreach to a consultant firm. So that delayed us by about 4 months, which we had planned to overcome. It would have been a challenge, no doubt about it, but we were still going to be on target with having an approved plan before our current one lapsed in approval in December of 2020, and then COVID happened. And so in January, obviously COVID started showing its ugly face, and then by March we were activated, and so was everybody else in the county and the entire country, for that matter, with responding to COVID. And so we as a region took it to a vote and asked our jurisdictions if they felt that they were going to be able to respond to COVID, as well as doing planning efforts between the months of March and June. And we decided as a group to put it on pause, which is where we currently are at now. But we're on target for a July approval. Now, I'm going to try to be nice when I say this, because obviously the majority of the planning partners are on the call, but there are challenges when you are talking about 27 jurisdictions, each with its own internal challenges and each with its own internal priorities. When we put it on pause, not everybody was 100% in agreement. And when we decided to restart, there was a lot of jurisdictions. There was a few jurisdictions who outright told us that they were swamped and they required a little bit more time and a little bit more assistance. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you have 27 participants in one plan, making sure that everybody's moving at the same pace does become challenging. And so we had to overcome that. And I think our planning group really was resilient in how we did overcome the challenge of COVID, working remotely, doing our public outreach remotely, interacting with departments that might not have been still working day to day or teleworking again. So while it was a challenging experience to say the least, I think our region and our partners really overcame that, and we have a pretty good product right now in place. And then this last one, I think, is traditionally something that a lot of us experience, is incorporating new ideas. It's the standards for a hazard mitigation plan have not changed. The DMA, or the Disaster Mitigation Act, which amended the Robert T. Stafford Act, was in 2000, I believe, and it hasn't been updated since. The guidance on hazard mitigation plans being approved and what's required of them hasn't changed since 2011. And so there's a lot of people, there's a lot of tradition in just doing what is required. And for me, I do want to be more forward thinking and more progressive in incorporating ideas. But again, when you have 27 partners, you can propose certain ideas, certain initiatives, but it takes a group to kind of move this plan forward. And we are a very, very large group that requires consensus. Again, it would be easier for me just to make the decision and push us in the direction that I see fit, but that's just not realistic, and that's not the authority that I have or the county has over any of our city and town or tribal nations that participate in this plan with us. So real quick, improvements that I would like to see incorporated, not only in our current plan, but into the future, and improvements that I have seen from our current plan that was approved in 2015 to now. We did a great job at collaborating regionally. With that, I would like to mention that, again, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you had silos that were in place, not a bad thing. People just wanted to get the plan approved, but this time around we saw jurisdictions cross plan with each other. So, one waterway that goes through the West Valley, identifying projects that people can collaborate on. That was unique, that was something new. So obviously anytime that you can have multiple jurisdictions collaborate on ideas, collaborate on projects, simplify the process, come to an understanding to mitigate the same risk to their communities is a great improvement, and it's awesome to see. The other improvement, and this is again just evolving in our planning efforts here in the region, as well as emergency management as a field as a whole, is not just checking boxes when it comes to the hazard mitigation plan, but making sure that it's just not a standalone document, that the hazard mitigation plan is incorporated into other planning documents. So if you have an emergency operation plan, or if you have a separate HIRA or a hazard analysis that you've completed, you have to include the hazard mitigation plan in those other documents. Every jurisdiction has a 20-year, 50-year master plan. So again, you can take what the information that you've gathered during the hazard mitigation process and incorporate that into your other planning conversations and other planning documents. And so the limitations for rules, with that, there's been a lot of push and a lot of conversation on incorporating human cause elements in the hazard mitigation plan. Again, like I just talked about, being progressive and including newer ideas. It's difficult. Changes is difficult for some people, and it does take time to kind of break through those barriers. And this is one of those, is just making sure that the plan is not just to check the box, but that it's doing what the whole goal of the hazard mitigation plan is to go through the hazard analysis, the community risk assessment, and come to a planning understanding of how to mitigate that risk for your community. And so it's a beautiful product when it's done correctly, and we have to get away from the thinking of just checking boxes. And process improvement, I think I've beat that one a little bit already. There's always new ideas, and I'm going to talk about one of those here in a second. But first, I didn't know who was going to be present, and I was asked to provide some examples of good mitigation work that the locals have done. And so I've selected 4 from the East and West Valley that I knew weren't going to be on the panel, of old efforts that were modified, or even new efforts that were identified in this update. And so Chandler has an amazing drought program that they have in place that they would like to work on over the next 5 years. Gilbert, same thing. They identified 2 great projects to identify the drainage area. So they're going to conduct some master study areas or projects within the town of Gilbert over the next 5 years. And so you can see the information that goes into each of the mitigation projects. So it's not just the 2 or 3 sentences. You got to actually identify the hazard that you're wanting to mitigate, who is going to be responsible, where the funding is going to come from, timeline again. So these are some examples from the East Valley that I was very impressed with. And then here's some from Phoenix as well as the West Valley. Again, being able to implement new programs for drought resiliency, as well as Phoenix has some very, very good heat initiatives that they want to embark on for the next 5 years. And so I don't want to spend too much time on this screen, but I did want to throw some kudos out there to some of our planning partners that really have embraced the challenge of mitigation and have collaboratively within their jurisdiction, went and said, here's what we have to do. How can we make it better? How can we improve upon not only the plan itself, but again, we're doing this for our community, for our residents. So for the next 5 years, the changes that I want to see incorporated, the vision that I have for the county's hazard mitigation plan is to continue to incorporate actions and projects. So the actions that we have in place are a great starting block, but new challenges present themselves between now and 5 years from now. So incorporating those new ideas, incorporating those new actions, simply just because we identified a fuels reduction project in one part doesn't mean that we can't do it in another. So continue to be innovative, to continue to support mitigation as a whole is something that I have a vision for the next couple of years. And then there's a link at the bottom. I don't want to copy and paste into URL, but the shining example of mitigation of what I want to see happen in the county is similar to what New York City has in place for their hazard mitigation plan. They have taken their information that is in a 600, 700 page document and made it into a very usable and easily digestible website where you have GIS information available, so you can plug in your address, see what hazards were identified, if there's any projects that were identified in its plan for that area to mitigate those risks. So you can click on it. So let's say there's a flood control initiative in unincorporated county. You can view the map that actually identifies the area that would then have that fuel or that flood levee or dam built to mitigate that risk. So it's a very snazzy website. It's something that we've talked about with ASU to kind of help us with, but that is something that hopefully here soon we can get off the ground and rolling on, at minimum included in our 5-year updates 5 years from now. So that's all I got. If there's any questions, obviously there's some in the chat. See if there's anything specific, or if one of the moderators can just go ahead and shout it out, because I don't have the chat open.
Yeah, we'll monitor the chat and we'll take the majority of our questions at the end after the 3. But Rudy, thank you.
All right,
so
perfect.
much. Really appreciate that.
Thanks for having me. I'll be around to answer any questions at the end. Tracy, I think you are up.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. As I said before, I'm Tracy Montgomery. I'm the emergency manager for the city of Surprise. And it's my hope to just share a little bit about how what Rudy just presented really gets put into context for individual cities. When I first got to the city of Surprise, my economic development director said, when you work for a city like with a name like Surprise, never miss the opportunity to make fun of yourself before someone else does. So my title of my presentation today is The Elements of Surprise, Hazard Mitigation. So hopefully we can start out with a lighthearted little bit of humor. So I wanted to start with where we were in the 2015 plan progress process, and Rudy already touched on the fact that we did a lot better in the 2020 plan than we did in the 2015 plan as far as collaboration and real involvement. So for a lot of our cities, the emergency manager is just a hat worn by somebody who does a lot of other tasks and responsibilities. So in 2015, we had a very small team that responded to the hazard mitigation project. It was led by the fire department, by a very talented battalion chief that wears many, many hats. He pulled a small group together, and he engaged in the process of responding to the plan. At that time, they were harvesting data from unaggregated information. We really didn't have a lot of readily available, handy information to help build the plan. So that it was a lot of legwork trying to gather the basic information that would help inform us how we really wanted to address hazards. We also didn't have a lot of actual plans. We had our strategic plan, but we didn't have other plans to look at to gather information from and maybe aggregate goals and objectives. And most importantly, I put an asterisk there. We really hadn't experienced any significant incidences. And so when you don't have incidences, I think a lot of times your city as a whole will tend to place priorities for hazard mitigation a little bit lower, because after all, these things are things we worry about, but they never really come to fruition. They never happen. So that gives everybody a real lack of context. So we weren't doing a whole lot of incident management training. We weren't doing a lot of citywide emergency response. And I think, you know, everybody experiences this, but the same 10 people that were worried about other emergency response were addressing our plan, our hazard mitigation plan. Of course, our water department, our fire department are responsible for the critical infrastructure. So we knew those two departments were engaged, but everybody else was otherwise involved with other issues. So as we look back on those 5 years since the 2015 plan was created, after that 2015 plan, some very insightful people, our current city manager was an assistant city manager at the time, and our police chief and our fire chief set 3 goals. They wanted to finalize a robust emergency operations plan. They wanted to hire an emergency manager, and they wanted to start really assessing threats and hazards, and then talking about responses. So that happened right after the plan was finished in 2016. And then we had our first incident. Here came that context that we really needed to make this a reality. Like a lot of us in the West Valley, we suffered a significant amount of storm damage from a microburst that hit the West Valley. We had a lot of storm damage to Surprise Stadium. Wind mostly, but then of course, once the wind leaves, we had flooding, rain flooding and wastewater. And then that involved a response, and we had to engage in recovery and mitigation for future wind incidences. So that really painted a picture that Surprise could actually be the subject of a disaster. 2017, that other goal came true. They started their emergency operations plan, got rolling on a robust emergency operations plan. And then in 2018, they hired their first emergency manager. That was me. And for the first time ever, for the city's Surprise, one person was solely and fully focused on strategies associated with emergency management and preparedness. In 2019, we focused on what our number one risk. I know my partners from National Weather Service are on the call. Shout out to them, but we applied for and finally qualified to be storm ready, a storm ready city, which really increased our capabilities, our response capabilities, and our mitigation so that we could be as prepared as possible for storms. Now this all is developing, but it's really unbeknownst to a lot of the participants, really supporting a better response to hazard mitigation in 2020. So going on with the timeline, we now start to gather more knowledge and experience that's going to help support us with the hazard mitigation plan. So we started doing threat and vulnerability assessments on Surprise Stadium and other critical infrastructure. We formalized our knowledge and triaged our critical infrastructure in water facilities. So we now had a large scale group that was focusing on that critical infrastructure. IT, we started focusing on IT critical infrastructure as well. And then we got up to speed and provided NIMS training to every single employee in the city of Surprise. So we were able to get those first two necessary NIMS courses, 100 and 700, to every single employee in the city of Surprise, which again increased our awareness. City started in 2020 planning their first ever continuity of operations plans. That's 17 departments. We created continuity of operations plans. And then, of course, when COVID hit, we stood up an incident management team to support the city response to business and community members as the pandemic was starting to disenfranchise underprivileged members of our community as well as businesses. And then, as we all know, amid the COVID response, the city started this process of the 2020 hazard mitigation plan process. Rudy talked about us suspending for 90 days our progress on this, which we all, for the most part, agreed upon. But while we were soaking in the fog of COVID response, we were gaining really, really valuable information about how a true response from an entire city really could be used to reflect upon to build a better plan. So 5 years after the 2015 plan, every single department leading into this 2020 plan had participated in assessments. They had participated in incident management teams for event planning and execution. We had, through the COOPs, we had documented all of our essential functions, associated essential staff, and of course, the facilities. And what we knew about facilities initially were that we had lists of multiple facilities and categories, but we didn't have single aggregated lists of all of these things, facilities, functions, and people. The COOP really took us there. We exercised response to planned and unplanned incidences. COVID was a big one, but we had some protest activity and some other things that really pulled in some normally not active incident management or not active in risk management types of tasks at the city were suddenly front and center in our response to some of these things. Our economic development, community development, and human services were some of our heroes in our COVID response. They had not participated in incident management before. So one of the things that came out of our discussions, both regionally and here in the city of Surprise, was, we really talk about climate change as a man-made issue, and this hazard mitigation plan typically doesn't deal with man-made hazards, but we really started recognizing that intersection between climate and some things that do threaten us that we more determined acts of nature, such as wildfire considerations and the impact that heat has on our city response in the context of human services and how economically it hits our city. So light bulb moment for us to kind of hopefully merge some of those discussions to talk a little bit more about heat. and how that really does sometimes distract us from the business of running the city, because we are urgently invested in making sure that people survive heat-related incidences. So as we look ahead, as we're wrapping up this 2020, what do we want to get done in the next 5 years? We, of course, want to continue to keep our eyes open to new hazards and risks. And for us, specific to critical infrastructure, we want to utilize the plan to investigate opportunities for mitigation that maybe we haven't thought about before. We're definitely on a path to train and expand our incident management capacity. COVID put a lot of our training on hold because we couldn't be in person. Now we've adjusted and we can do training either separately, or we're now able to safely gather. And one of the things I mentioned in the last slide is we really want to leverage that community and business engagement momentum that we gained in our COVID response to support overall community resilience. So how do our all of our departments do outreach and kind of support the plan to respond and support the community, not just the city as a business, as we respond to hazards. So exploring the impacts of heat in more formal ways is going to be a big part of our dialogue moving forward, maybe outside of the hazard mitigation, purely the hazard mitigation plan goal, but certainly we know that's an issue that's not going away, and it's probably increasing in urgency. So it's on our radar. So that's been a great benefit of this process. That's all I have, a little bit of a down and dirty summary of where we are and where we're going. I look forward to answering your questions here. I'll turn it over to Michelle from Tempe, and she can talk a little bit about how Tempe approached this process.
Yeah, I'm going to unmute and start my video so you guys can see me. Hopefully you can all see my screen here. I'm Michelle Seitz. I am the City of Tempe Emergency Manager. So thank you for allowing me to come and speak to you today. I'm excited to do so. In the process of discussing what I should touch on during this presentation, it was recommended that I offer my thoughts on hazard mitigation planning and process, supply you with some feedback on how the experience was participating with my partners across Maricopa County. And to be perfectly honest, the first thing I thought of was how absolutely thrilled I was to participate in this type of mitigation planning for this year, not only because it did give me an overview of the hazards that I had to be aware of here in the city of Tempe, but I'd recently moved from the state of Wisconsin to Arizona. And so I was absolutely giddy not to have to plan for, I'm just gonna switch for this. No more blizzard or ice storm warnings, anything like that. I know it's kind of silly, but I had to put that out there because that gets really old after a while of the white stuff. As we say in Wisconsin, you know, we don't have hurricanes, and that's kind of what we tell ourselves so that we don't fall apart when it's 20 below and we have snow up to our eyeballs and we're out there shoveling. So, but anyway, that was one of the key things I did really think about. That was, oh my gosh, I get to plan for something completely different. So seriously, it was a great timing, because as a new emergency manager in a completely new region of the country, it gave me a better perspective of the hazards I needed to focus on. And as you can see here in the community description, risk assessment, mitigation strategies that we went through, and the planned maintenance strategy, it allowed me to completely immerse myself into this region and to collaborate with my new partners across the county and get to know everybody better. So from the City of Tempe perspective, specifically developing our plan integration strategy for the next 5 years. So this is what we submitted for that section of our hazard mitigation plan. It really outlined and kind of was an aha moment for me, in that it really interconnected all of our work throughout the city and how it plays a part in emergency preparedness and community resilience. It is simply a matter of how we connect the dots. And I'll show you that. So our long-term asset management plan. So one of the projects in that plan is a well asset maintenance and new production. It will add new groundwater production and recovery well capacity to the Tempe municipal system for backup water production and supplemental drought supply water. You don't necessarily think of municipal utilities department as a partner in our community resilience and preparedness, but indeed they are. And so the question is, how do we connect with them and how do we provide them with the preparedness lens? So when they determine their next projects, they can look for ways to increase community resiliency and preparedness as well. And the City of Tempe's Climate Action Plan includes the investment in community hubs. So these hubs can serve residents with limited incomes. Human Services can provide programs within these hubs 365 days a year. And as residents begin to use these hubs and go there for these programs, why not begin to provide them with emergency preparedness materials and education that will help to build community resiliency? The hubs can be a great resource during a disaster and as part of the whole community-based approach to emergency management. So our sustainability office clearly understands the need for community resiliency and preparedness, but does community development and human services see through the lens resilience and emergency preparedness lens when they develop their plans and assist the community? I would argue that some, especially from the human services area, understand the importance of it, but we could begin to meet and collaborate as we move forward and bring that lens to light a little bit more. We have the Urban Forest Master Plan, which provides tree and shade canopy coverage to mitigate the effects of extreme heat on our community. Now, clearly that's a terrific example of mitigation and resilience, but how often does community services and parks link what they do with resilience or emergency management? So the plan integration, the other plan was the Tempe's multi-year training and exercising plan. And that brings together, it's actually kind of evolved into an integrated preparedness plan. And it brings together the Maricopa County multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation specific Tempe plans. It also brings the City of Tempe's top hazard vulnerability assessment items that are specific to the City of Tempe. So this document builds on the natural hazards in the larger hazard mitigation plan, but also adds technical hazards, human hazards, and hazardous materials. The section for capability assessment, corrective action, and improvement plans from real life and exercises, as 2020 was, well, 2020. And so these are all real life after action reports that we have because a lot of things happened in 2020 that were real life, didn't even have time to exercise that we've learned from. So in addition, our city's preparedness priorities for 2021 and 2024 are spelled out as well in this document. Our city's departments, in order to develop strategies to link with our partners in the community, and then also we want to link with the partners within our city departments so that we can begin to build this, and this effort begins to be a bit more about resilience and emergency preparedness in the overall City of Tempe. So the next few slides are actually what we put in our plan this year for heat mitigation actions. Now, we are very fortunate to have ASU here, right here, to collaborate with. And so these are the new hazmat measures for the next 5 years that are specifically related to heat mitigation. So this is what we've turned in as the City of Tempe. Now you can see this brings our community partners on board, but also our departments within the City of Tempe, which is so necessary. And so if we were to make a difference as we strategize and move forward, we need to continue to do this. We have this kind of put in little sections. So this right here is our coordination, education, and training section. And it incorporates our CERT trainings, training for staff on heat, economic development. As you can see, our human services is also involved in here, and engineering and transportations involving in training for residents. And the Climate Youth Council. So these are all new organizations that will be institutionalized. And we've added community services in here, human services in here, intergovernmental officers in here, and equity and inclusion manager as well. So we're going to have a task force, a regional resilience collaborative, and regional cooling utility. And these are the plans, codes, and standards rules an extreme heat action plan, relief plan, that urban forestry master plan, bringing in the community services and parks and recreation. Our community services for shade and cool material additions for new buildings, and zoning code adoption, GIS standards adoption. We have engineering and transportation in there, and sustainability, information technology as well, in order to get databases and inventory, as well on impact assessments on how extreme heat is actually affecting our operations, and the policy work to acquire federal and state resources and just research into cool materials. And then our built environment, which also, as you can see, kind of goes all around our city departments and our community partners. So we have resources and equipment for a medical examiner's office, the mountain rescue equipment, monitoring of heat data, cooling centers, amenity for our pools. So that's park and rec and community services for heat relief. Additional splash pads to provide heat relief for youth, resiliency hubs and our Envision hubs, and mobile generators and AC units, microgrids, shaded cool parks, islands, artificial shade structures, and transit shelters, streetscapes, multi-use and canal paths and streetscapes, public buildings and GI pilot projects. And as you can see to the far right, we're really including a lot of our departments in this, engineering and transportation, equity and inclusion, public works and water utilities, the city engineer and transportation and engineering, and sustainability and community development. And that's really where we're looking. We're looking to bring our departments together and start talking about this, so that when we do get together and we start making our plans for the future and strategies on what we're going to tackle in the city, we can all kind of look through that lens of emergency preparedness and resiliency, and we can kind of see that big picture and how it brings us all together. So that's kind of how we're looking at this. And this happens to be our heat mitigation actions, but I believe you can do that in a lot of your other hazard mitigation, actions that you're taking, not just heat necessarily, but just bringing in your departments as well, and in your whole city as a whole. And thank you. That is my presentation today, and I'll be happy to take any questions.